Be sure to follow me on Instagram. There you can hang out with me and talk to me directly. Okay, so we are continuing on with our series on The Boys, and I dig doing this series, right? Like I dig doing this. I feel like we should cover Invincible since it's getting a Netflix series next year. I think we should do that. Like that would be pretty cool, right? Just like hammer out a whole bunch of Invincible videos. I really wish they would make a series about Irredeemable. That's a good one, the one by Mark Waid. Irredeemable centers on basically Superman, right? He's not really called Superman, but it's essentially Superman, and it's like he saves the day. It's like his first outing, I think, and like he saves the day and becomes corrupted by like all the praise he gets and goes crazy and like just starts killing all the superheroes. Dude, it's really good. Like it's like an amazing series. That's the thing. Like Marvel and DC have some really good stuff, but if you want to get to like the really amazing stuff that's kind of off the beaten path, you got to go look at like creator-owned comics. Like those are some of the coolest things you're going to see. But in any event, this video on The Boys, we focus on the origin of the superheroes, right? Like this timeline, like Vought American's rise to power, right? So for those of you guys who are basically wondering how things got to this point, this is the one that will cover all that stuff. And what it does is it winds back to World War II, right? So it tells us that Vought American has been a company in the United States for a long time, like for a very long time. The issue with this is that Vought American was providing some really shoddy weaponry. The Vought American, like a lot of companies out there that put profits over quality of product, was basically cutting corners everywhere. That they were creating like really shoddy products, right? Like they were creating like playing something called the Grizzly, which basically didn't really work, right? Like the engines would give out if you went too fast, the guns wouldn't fire consistently, and they were implemented in World War II by Vought American as a relatively new product that could help win the war. And the result was that the US almost lost the war because of it, right? I mean, the war in the Pacific was kind of the turning tide, right? The Battle of Midway, you know, like island hopping, things like that. Like if we'd lost the Battle of Midway, Japan would have taken and we would have lost. Like we would have lost World War II. And so or at least the United States would have been defeated during World War II. I won't go as far as to say we would have lost entirely. It's interesting with this because what it shows is right off the bat, in the very beginnings, Vought American didn't really care about the quality of the product they made. They cared about the money they can make off that product. Not only that, it shows right off the bat that what Vought American was looking for was to gain a foothold and really gain like kind of dominance over military contracts. And so all this is really told from the perspective of the legend, right? Basically giving this information to Huey. Now, there is a kind of segment that goes on here with regards to Billy Butcher and to Homelander, but for the most part, it's really just kind of them having a stare down and not a lot comes out of it, right? I mean, but the meat and potatoes of this is really the history of like Vought American and how it all comes together. And so what you ended up getting here is basically this idea that Vought American got some measure of a foothold, not a big one, but got some measure of a foothold in various military applications, more or less, you know, implementing their various schemes and different things along those lines. Like they got a huge hand in all of that. And the reason why is because they knew all the right people, right? They had people in all the right places. And so while technically they should never have had the opportunity to implement a lot of these really crappy products, they did, because they knew people who were not really presidents or vice presidents of the White House, but they knew people in like the Pentagon, they knew people in Congress, and they could basically get signatures on products that they were making in order to implement them in the military industrial complex. Following that went directly into Vietnam. And where their initial outing in World War II was kind of like, okay, so it didn't really go the way we'd hoped, but like, hey, look, we can make it work this time, all right? Everything will work, everything will be okay. What you ended up having was this scenario where a portion of troops were like outnumbered by like Viet Cong forces. And the concern was these guys are all going to be taken out. But the response was, well, we're using Vought American weapons, right? So like, you know, we've got all these arms and armament, like there's no way these guys can take us all out. And the result was that because yet again, Vought American was creating really shoddy products, these products failed when they were needed. And so what it meant was that like 1,000 soldiers were all killed. Like they all died in this massive confrontation that went on between the US and Viet Cong forces. And so following this, what it led to is for a time after Vietnam and like the catastrophic failure of Vought American, essentially, what happened was Vought American basically just sort of vanished for like 3 years. They were gone. And then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, a meteor falls from the sky, it crash lands in Heartland America, and there's a superpowered person there, right? And so following that, you know, this kid basically aged up, you know, super fast. It's like this Superman story, more or less. And so when this kid's paraded out by Vought American, he's everything people want him to be, right? Very Superman-esque. For example, there was a really good article that not really a good article, well, there was a good article, but Mark Waid had an interview in it, and he said one of the reasons why Superman has always been so popular is because he's everything to everyone. He's a champion of the oppressed in whatever era the oppressed are currently in, right? Like he's always their champion fighting on their behalf in comic books, more or less. This guy coming out here, he was loved by everyone, right? Like, he was a humble guy, so he didn't really present himself as an imposing figure that somehow made men feel emasculated, right? You know, because I guess their confidence is tied directly into how they perceive other men around them. He didn't really offend any, like, at least when it came to women, because of the fact that he was slightly vulnerable. What it meant is they had romance. They were like, well, here's a vulnerable guy, and maybe I can sort of slowly chip away and figure out what goes on with him and figure out how he works, you know, and that kind of a thing. When it came to people who were right-wing, people who were conservative, they loved him because he was powerful. For people who were on the left, he was intelligent, right? So they loved the fact that he was a smart guy. So it was basically one of these things that was like everything to everyone, right? Like he was literally what everybody wanted him to be. And the result was that he immediately became exceedingly popular. Following that, there were 6 other people who popped up. And so what the legend basically says is, like, as far as the world was concerned, these were just superpowered beings who seemingly came out of nowhere. And Vought American, who you know, previously had less than stellar success when it came to weapons manufacturing, is now having huge success as a marketing company, you know? So it's like people never really tied the two together. But the reality is that Vought American created these guys, right? Because Vought American looked at their ability to create guns and like tanks and arms and armament, things like that, and they couldn't do it in an effective way that could generate a profit margin, right? Like they were cutting too many corners. And so they said, well, let's get into genetic engineering. Let's get into manipulating genes. Now, in terms of how that happens, you know, we end up figuring that out later on, but they developed Compound V. And the result was that developing Compound V allowed them to modify a human being in the fetus and then in turn give birth to a superpowered being. And it's kind of a funny thing because Huey asked the question, why did they only create 7? And the legend says, well, like literally the injection you got from Billy Butcher that enhanced your abilities, that gave you what you have right now, that's just one injection, and that costs $19 billion. Imagine how much it costs to make one of these guys. And so that kind of makes sense, right? If you're talking about, you know, something that would cost upwards to possibly even like $1 trillion in order to engineer a human being from the time it's a fetus to the time that it's born to develop superpowers, and then to make those superpowers controllable so that it's not just Cyclops, right? Where like Homelander opens his eyes and everything in front of him gets totally eradicated. You know, in order to avoid something like that, you're talking about a massive feat in genetic engineering. It would be almost unfeasible to be able to mass produce that on a huge scale. At the same time, the genius behind that is it allows them to do it in such a way to where the number remains controllable. It's much easier to control 7 superheroes than it is 700 superheroes. And so in response to that came what were basically a handful of different groups, right? You ended up getting groups called the Young Americans, you ended up getting Payback, you ended up getting Teenage Kicks, you ended up getting G-Men, but the 7 were the only ones who really had any major backing of Vought American behind them. The other ones who were there were just the result of experimentation, that kind of a thing, either accidents or something along those lines, but they weren't really bred to be the absolute best. The 7 were bred to be the best, right? The absolute best of what any superhero could be, with Homelander being the best of them, right? So he's the best version of a character. What's kind of cool about this whole thing is you get a guy named Johann Vogelbaum, at least I think is how you pronounce it, and it's very Captain America-esque, right? For those of you guys who are familiar with Captain America's history, Abraham Erskine was a guy who was discovered to basically create a super soldier serum. He was taken from Germany by Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos, brought to the United States, and he became part of Project Rebirth. This basically this same process happens here, insofar that Johann Vogelbaum did not want to create super soldiers for the Germans, and so he was basically brought to the United States and started creating Compound V for Vought American instead. The crazy thing about this is he didn't really know what the intention of Vought American was. For the most part, it seemed like they intended to keep him in the dark. They didn't really seem to, didn't really intend to tell him what the extensive nature of it was. The issue with this is that once Vogelbaum began to realize that the purpose behind Vought American creating superhumans basically was nefarious, insofar that it wasn't really for the purpose of protecting the world so much as like acquiring profit and really for like nefarious means, he ended up basically, offing himself more or less. Didn't really want to be boxed into a corner or anything. But then that gets into the role of the legend himself, and this gets in the role of comic books, and it's the absolute smartest thing that possibly could have been done by Vought American. And the reason why is because in any given particular circumstance, not just the modern day, but over the course of the history of humanity, the nature of people is that people will believe what they want to believe. That people wanted to believe that superheroes were good guys. People wanted to believe that superheroes were there to protect them. And so in order for Vought American to feed the people what they wanted to believe, they created comic books. And the entire basis behind these comic book stories was to basically feed people the narrative they wanted to hear. Now, this is pretty bad. Like it's a really crappy thing to do. And the reason why is because for the most part, the American people can't really be trusted when it comes to things. Like the average person can't really be trusted with things, especially if what they want to believe flies in the face of what's good for them. And so because of that, like if people say like, well, we really want to destroy the country using nuclear bombs, well, that's not beneficial for society. So you can't put that kind of trust in the hands of people. You take that trust away from them and say, what you want will lead to the destruction of society. So we're taking that away from you, right? Because you're an idiot, basically. Like you want to goose step yourself into your own oblivion. We can't trust you with that, and so you can't always put trust in the hands of the people. But when you look at this and you say, okay, what you have here is them feeding the narrative that heroes are good guys, no wonder the world turned out the way that it did. Because what you had is you had a scenario where you had a company, a weapons manufacturing company, that was producing biological weapons in the form of superheroes, and then people refusing to believe that there could have been a nefarious purpose there, or even doing any investigation, automatically assumed they're here to help us. And so because they wanted to assume that, they wanted to believe that. And so in turn, Vought American fed them what they wanted to believe, and then really just kind of people stuck their head in the sand, and everything just sort of ended up where it is right now. It really is intriguing there, because it's one half the fault of people, and then the other half the fault of a company. At the end of the day, when it comes down to like who really bears responsibility there, who do you point the finger at? At the end of the day, I would point the finger at the people, right? I would say it's the people's fault. They could have done their own investigation. They could have done any number of things. They could have found the facts if they wanted to, because the facts were there. It's interesting because what the legend would do is comb through all these different stories. And what he would do is he would take a scenario that happened in the real world, and then he would change the outcome of that scenario to reflect what people wanted to see. And so there's this one situation where it's like, okay, he goes out to the middle of nowhere, out in some state somewhere, and he ends up fighting against some villain, and where like he basically just like flies through the villain and like punches a hole through that guy and just kills him, beheads him in the most gruesome way. The comic book story plays out much differently. Oh, well, we're fighting yet again, and so on, you can't defeat me this time. And it takes what's basically a careless superhero who has no real regard for the lives of the people who he's essentially facing off against, and paints him as a guy who's a good guy. He's fighting the good fight, all that kind of stuff. Very patriotic, in that sense. And it's interesting the way that it's depicted, because that's just not really the way the superheroes function, but it's the way they're depicted to function, so it's what people assume to be true. And so the question after that was, if Vought American has essentially engineered superheroes and is using them as a means to attain power, then the question becomes, what's the next step? How do you get Vought American from a company that's engineering superheroes to a company that has a foothold and has control in the United States? And so what they end up doing is they end up basically getting a former businessman to attain the position of the Vice President of the United States to work on their behalf. The problem with this is that what Vought American is doing has not gone unnoticed. And that's why I said, my argument with the people, you could point the finger at the people and say it's your fault because you allowed this to happen by just ignoring the reality of the situation and believing what you want to believe. When you had other companies, other corporations looking at this and saying, okay, so like Vought American is basically engineering superheroes. Vought American is creating superheroes and then using that as a means to basically say, hey, look, we can use this to safeguard the United States. Just give us weapons contracts, US government, and everything will be okay. That other companies were trying to fight against them to keep that from happening. Now, other companies weren't doing this because it was the right thing to do. Other companies were doing this because they saw Vought American as a challenge to their rule. Why do you need tanks? And why do you need guns? And why do you need bullets and things like that if all you have to do is send Homelander in and instill such an extreme amount of fear in the enemy that they'll be terrified to attack the United States or any property that belongs to the United States, lest Homelander go in, kill all the soldiers and all their families, right? So you could use that as a weapon against the enemy. You don't need to send in US forces. And so if you're Lockheed Martin and your entire platform is based on the process of like creating missiles or creating this or creating that or something along those lines, or you're Boeing and you create like military craft, military planes that go out and do things. I don't know if Boeing really does that. If you're one of those guys who are weapons manufacturers, you're literally like, okay, so our survival's at risk here. And so fighting for survival, what they did is they ended up getting like the president of the United States elected. Like over this period of time, over this short period of time, because of this mad race to ensure survival in the military industrial complex, companies were dumping money into Congress. It reached a point where like 2/3 of Congress and the president and the vice president were bought and paid for by companies, right? So like America is exceedingly corrupt at this point in time when the story takes place. And so as a result of that, you basically had Vic the Veep, who was working on behalf of Vought American, albeit the guy was an idiot and basically just took orders. Then you have the president of the United States working on behalf of everybody else in the military industrial complex. And that's the reason why, so long as the president is in office, nothing from Vought American will get passed in terms of weapons contracts, and the president won't let it happen. Any bill presented by Congress will basically be vetoed by the president. And where you could look at that and you could say, okay, but like a 2/3 majority vote could overrule the presidential veto. Congress is split, right? I mean, like half belongs to all these companies and half belongs to Vought American, and that's just 2/3 of Congress, not even the other third. There's no real way to ensure a presidential veto is overturned in Congress itself. And so as a result of that, there's this massive moment that comes along, right? Where Vaught Americans kind of in a position where they have the vice president there and they say, okay, fine, then let's use the court of public opinion. Let's use public opinion to force the president's hand, right? Like let's use that as a means to control him, right? Because at the end of the day, Congress exists to ensure its position, right? Like any congressman, congresswoman, or any senator basically serves the purpose of trying to secure a re-election. It's what they do. That's their goal. And so as a result of that, if in the face of public opinion, the public says, if you do not impeach the sitting president, then in turn, we're going to kick you out of office, Congress is going to impeach the sitting president. If they believe there's a credible threat to losing their position, if they don't impeach the president, then they're basically going to be outed. And so in order to try to force the president's hand to either step down or force Congress to impeach him, what they end up doing is crafting public opinion in such a way so that when 9/11 basically goes down in this comic, it doesn't go down exactly the same way it did here in the States. Instead, the way things happen is like, hijackers had taken one of the planes, they were supposed to crash it into one of the towers, jets were sent in to respond and to take these passenger liners down, and then out of nowhere, they were told, stand down, like back down. And so the result of this is that seemingly under the direction of the vice president, which begs the question, what was the president doing? Under the direction of the vice president, you end up having all these fighter jets which stand down and the 7 respond. The issue with this is the 7 had no idea what they were doing. These guys aren't trained. And that's the biggest issue here. They don't go through like hostage rescue training. They don't know how to talk people down. They don't know any of that stuff. They're people who were basically engineered to have superpowers, and then like seemingly overnight, they were elevated to what a lot of people praise as like God status, basically. I mean, that's one of the things that's said here is when Vaught American goes as far as to poll the American people and to say, would you support electing like Homelander to the position of president? People were like, no, because it'd be like electing Jesus to the office of the presidency. It's just too much power in the hands of a person who's too powerful. What stops him from never giving that power up, And so because of that, people were just kind of like, okay, when the 7 fly in here and the 7 get in there, it's a total show. And that's exactly what it is. Like they get in there, they have no clue what they're doing, right? Like they're in there like, okay, so we're going to open the doors and we're going to take out these hostages. At this point, probably not 30,000 feet, probably something more to like, 15, 20,000 feet in the air. They rip open one of the doors of the airplane. Some kids yanked out, like people are being sucked out left and right. They get in there, everything goes to pop. But instead of it just being Queen Maeve and being Homelander, you've also got like Marathon Man. You've got a handful of people here. You've got Lamplighter. Things are kind of popping off and things are going nuts. And so when they get in there, like Homelander, totally overwhelmed by like all the screaming and the crying and the panicking, sort of loses his mind. He gets in there, he takes out some of the terrorist guys and then destroys the flight system in the process. He looks at Queen Maeve, he's like, I thought you had a plan. She's like, well, no, I thought you had a plan. Like nobody really knows what anybody's supposed to do. None of this was planned out. And so with the plane essentially in a position to where it's going to go crashing down, the question is like, are you going to save them? And the response is, there's nothing we can do. Like Homelander's just like, forget about it. Like whatever, who cares? It's a total disregard. He's like, whatever, man, let's just go. Like Marathon Man lashes onto him. He's basically a stand-in for the Flash. Marathon Man grabs him and ends up, kind of flying with him. And then it's like, look, dude, the plane's going to hit the city. And so then you end up having like Homelander who flies into the plane, ends up like breaking it in half, and the plane crashes into the Brooklyn Bridge and takes out the Brooklyn Bridge. Marathon Man is killed in the process. And it's just like the whole thing is just a total cluster. Because what you ended up having is you had these guys who were totally untrained. They don't know how to handle these things, right? There's a reason why specialized teams are trained in such a way to where they basically go through and they practice routines like this over and over and over again so that when things like this happen, they can respond accordingly. This is like grabbing a handful of cops off the street and then just throwing them into a situation. Of course they're not going to know what to do. Like, of course they're not going to know how to handle it because they haven't been trained for it. And so in the aftermath of this, there were 2 things that went down. One, you had the American people who were mad that an attack happened on their soil. You had the American people who were asking questions like, how could this attack have happened? And then in turn, you had the American people angry, wanting like somebody to pay for it. The issue with this is that if the American people had learned that 1, the government was asleep at the wheel, which led to the attack happen in the first place, and 2, that the plane crashing into the Brooklyn Bridge was the result of the 7 screwing up, the American people would have turned on the government and Vaught American. And so as a result of that, working in tandem, what ended up happening is basically a finger was pointed at Pakistan. The government said, well, those are the ones to blame. Let's go get them. And they took the American people's eyes off of them. The American people bought into it hook, line, and sinker, and basically looked directly at Pakistan and said, let's go get them. And then at the same time, Vaught American used Victory Comics, used their comic book arm as a means to sweep it all under the rug and to say, well, the 7 did everything they could. There's nothing they could have done here. They did their best. By God, they fought the good fight. And that's basically, that's really what happened here. And the American people bought into it as well. And so as a result of that, seemingly a lot of hands came out squeaky clean that otherwise should not have here. And so following following that, what you ended up getting into was basically the launch of the Boys, the creation of the Boys organization. Now, what the legend basically tells Huey is that the formation of the Boys originally came by a guy named Greg D. Mallory. And Greg D. Mallory fought during World War II and had a vendetta against everything that was going on with the idea of the superheroes and so on and so forth. But the issue with this was that he initially walked away with the first iteration of the Boys. And the reason why is because he was a guy who would dig up information and look for weaknesses when it came to the Boys making their moves. They were a lot more heavy-handed. Like they would strike hard and fast. Well, the problem with this is that if you strike in that way, you're going to get an equal response to that. And so as a result, with Homelander and them realizing that they're being screwed around with, that somebody's messing with them, and then ultimately rooting it back to Greg D. Mallory, Lamplighter goes through and kills Greg D. Mallory's granddaughters. And so as a response to that, because the battle came so close to home, Mallory backed off. Mallory basically walked away from the Boys after experiencing this kind of crushing sensation the way that he did. And the Boys essentially seem to have disbanded, or at the very least, taken less of a heavy-handed approach. And that's the reason why now, when Billy Butcher launches his missions, he doesn't do it so heavy-handedly. He doesn't go in guns blazing, launching this full-on attack against all the various characters. Instead, it's espionage, subterfuge. It's using a very secretive hand to basically say, hey, look, like, just so you know, we're watching you and we're making moves against you, but we're not doing it in such a heavy-handed way. It's grabbing information. That's really what's really the big thing that goes on with the Boys at the moment. And it's the reason why Homelander and company don't just show up and kill them all, is because there's safeguards in place. With all the information the Boys have gathered, if they all basically die, that information would be let out to the media, and the whole world would really see what the Seven are actually like in terms of video footage and all that kind of stuff. And no longer would the American people be able to kind of just ignore the reality of the situation. They would have to take their head out of the sand and then look around and realize, okay, so yeah, things aren't really what we thought they were. You know, it's essentially how things would go down. At the same time, if the Boys made a hard move against the Seven would take him out. We basically have an armistice, right? We've got a ceasefire, albeit grudgingly, but we've got a ceasefire going on. Neither one of us are launching that hard of an attack against the other. And so what they ended up doing, in order to kind of set things in stone, in order to sort of keep things kind of locked up, a sort of treaty was signed, more or less, in the form of like a sacrifice, in the form of a character that was going to be executed. And that's the reason why Lamplighter, for those of you guys who have been following this, that's why Lamplighter went missing, is because the official story was, well, we don't know where Lamplighter is. Lamplighter's taking a break, essentially. You know, Lamplighter is taking a break from being part of the Seven. Meet our new member, Starlight. When the reality was, Lamplighter was sacrificed. You know, it was basically one of these things where the Boys were like, if you do not give us somebody, we're dumping everything out there. And so in response to this, the Seven said, okay, fine. Lamplighter is the one that killed the granddaughters of Greg D. Mallory. You guys get to have Lamplighter, and Lamplighter was killed by the Boys. And that was kind of the ceasefire that was basically agreed upon between the two groups, because the bloodshed was so extreme. And that was the reality of it. Both groups had so much to lose. They had so much to lose here that it was kind of like, okay, let's create a ceasefire. Let's kind of keep things, you know, sort of on the back burner at the moment. And so that's one of the questions that's asked here by Huey is, well, then what's your involvement in all this? You know, like, what led you to become the person that you are right now? Why are you divulging all this? And what we end up learning is that basically Legend has a vendetta against Vought American that stems all the way back to the Vietnam War, that he lost a son there, that he lost a son due to like their malfunctioning weapons and their willingness to cut corners and so on and so forth. And he's always held a vendetta against them. Once they started manufacturing superheroes and he started realizing how far down the rabbit hole it went, when he was working with the company, he was basically stockpiling information. Once everything came to a head and it was like, okay, so now they're creating superheroes and I'm crafting the narrative for these superheroes, you know, working for this company, Victory Comics, so on and so forth. It was stockpiling information to the side and using that information and passing it to the Boys later on, which is how he became involved in their organization in the first place. It's actually really interesting and it's really, really intriguing here. And so because we've covered so much in this short amount of time, I'm going to cover the other half of this in next week's video, right? Everything that was going on with regards to Starlight and so on and so forth. This is a lot of origin story to cover. It's certainly one of the most packed stories that Garth Ennis did when it came to the Boys, dumping like a ton of information in there, right? So we're going to tack this on. We're going to do the other half in the video next week. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.